traffic monitoring is to know which assets are connecting to which services right now. Network modeling is which assets can connect to which services.
Welcome everyone to the Industrial Security Podcast. I'm Nate Nelson, here with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and the guest of our show today. Andrew, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Robin Berthier. He is the CEO and co-founder of Network Perception. You know, the episode's title is Set and Forget is Not Cyber Resiliency. It's a bit cryptic. What we're going to be looking at is a technology that I did not know existed. It's a technology that compares what we have to what we're supposed to have in our network access systems. And it tells us when we're drifting security-wise.
Then without further ado, here's your conversation with Robin.
Hello, Robin, and welcome to the podcast. Before we get going, can you maybe tell us a few words about yourself and about the good work that you're doing at Network Perception?
Thanks, Andrew, for having me. My name is Robin Berthier. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Network Perception. We are a cybersecurity software company focusing on protecting, critical assets in OT environment. I studied my career in industrial control systems as a research scientist. So prior to Network Perception, I was at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, working through the Information Trust Institute with funding from DOE, DHS to design and develop the next generation of software and solution to better visualize and verify how we protect and check critical networks. Our goal is to empower practitioners and professionals in those environments to have a much better visibility and better tools to defend themselves.
And our topic today is about how set and forget is not cyber resiliency. I think, I have an idea of what set and forget is, but can you level set us? Can you walk us through what is set and forget in your mind and why is it a concern?
ICS environments have non-negotiable priorities. And the number one, safety. You have heavy machinery, high voltage. So safety is the top priority. And second, operational availability. You need to keep, your operations running, whether you are a manufacturing plant, a power station, a water treatment plant. And, until recently, cybersecurity wasn't, part of those top priorities. And I think most organizations with a industrial control system are going through, I would say, 3 phases of maturity. Phase 1 was, we don't need cybersecurity because we are air-gapped. There's no connection, so we don't need it. Phase 2 was actually we may need some cybersecurity because we're seeing our neighbors getting hacked. And then phase 3, which I think most organizations are in today, is we absolutely need it. We need to raise the bar there in terms of defending ourselves against adversaries. But how to get started? Our environment is complex. We have a mix of legacy and modern technology. We have geographically distributed hardware. So where do we start to be more secure? And one of the key technique to start securing your environment is to segment your network and put firewalls. But I think we too many times we purchase a firewall, we put in the environment, and then we check the checkbox there, and we think that we're set. Like we have that. It's we're all good, and we can forget about it. And the reality is that now network environments are much more dynamic than before. We have evolving technology. threats are getting more sophisticated. We have new employees working, new partnerships with other organizations. So we need to be able to periodically check and review whether those firewalls that we've been putting in place are still, defending our critical assets correctly. And it's a arms race against, more and more sophisticated attacks. And that's why we need to have this continuous verification mindset, which is really different from the set and forget approach that we had in the past. An example to illustrate that is like recently, in the pipeline industry, like TSA switched from voluntary cybersecurity approach to now a framework with enforcement to really push pipeline owners and operators in the US to adopt a cybersecurity strategy with a set of documents and plan to make sure that they do those continuous verification and periodic check of the network segmentation. So everything was voluntary until Colonial Pipeline, then be high profile breach, and then TSA came back with a pretty stringent framework to ensure that we're transitioning from that voluntary base to a enforced set of rules around cybersecurity. But that's not easy. In OT, again, we have still that safety and operational availability priorities that are non-negotiable. We need to, help the industry, and that means to develop solutions that are aware of the OT requirements, finding ways that are, lightweight, highly usable, providing instant value, and then fitting those solutions into a larger umbrella of, what we call cyber resiliency. It's a journey. How do we go step by step into making sure that we are becoming, cyber resilient organizations?
And our topic today is cyber resilience. I mean, I've heard the word resilience a lot lately, and the word seems to mean something different every time I hear it. Can you talk about what cyber resilience means to you, and really, whatever it means, can you tell us, how do you do that?
Really, I recommend, leveraging the great document that NIST put together around building cyber resilient systems. It's the, special publication 800-160 volume 2. It all starts with a risk assessment strategy. It's a document that you put in place to make sure that all stakeholders are aligned with this objective of becoming cyber resilient. Then you, from the document, you define your goals that may be specific to your organization. What are your critical operations? What are your critical assets? What are the critical cyber assets controlling that industrial equipment? And then once you have this, that define the assets identified, then you can start measuring where you are with your goal and invest in what we call the cyber resiliency techniques or cyber resiliency building blocks. And the NIST document is listing 14 of them. They are organized in 4 categories. The first is gaining visibility and understanding on your environment. The second is defense in depth, having multiple layers of defenses so that if one is breached, you have backups. Number 3 is consistently adopting and following a principle of least privilege, restricting access and giving permission to for users to access specific services on a need-to-know basis. And then the fourth one is to develop capabilities to recover, faster. We call that the agile recovery capabilities. So among those 4, categories of building blocks, the most important one is to get started is network visibility. You won't be able to defend an infrastructure if you don't know what you have in that infrastructure and how things are connected. So that's really where I focus my efforts.
So Nate, Robin said that the drive towards resilience in 800.160, the drive towards cybersecurity and industrial networks generally starts with protecting the network. You buy a firewall. I he's absolutely right. I mean, historically, back in what was it, '07, the very first ISA standard came out. SP 99-1-1. This became 62443-1-1, and half of the standard talked about, introduced the terms zones and conduits, and talked about, talked about segmenting your networks, talked about organizing your networks into groups of similar assets that have, similar security characteristics, similar communications and other needs. Often the very first technology investment anybody makes in a cybersecurity initiative for industrial operations is to buy a firewall, get the OT network off of the IT network. This is Security 101. Hopefully, most of our listeners are past that point and have long since segmented their OT from their IT networks.
Robin also mentioned their 800-160, and I don't think that he's the first guest in recent memory to have done so. Andrew, is there something to talk about there?
Yeah, I've been meaning to read the standard. I have it open in front of me here. It's a bit of a stretch. It's 300 pages. But it's talking about resilient systems. Some of these techniques seem sort of basic. They seem to echo what's happening in the industrial world. Some of them seem, a little advanced, and I don't know if they're really a good fit for the industrial world, but stuff like deception, mislead, confuse, hide critical assets from our adversaries, dynamic creation and destruction of assets. This is like virtual machines, create stuff when you need it and then get rid of it. Redundancy, obviously, segmentation, obviously. So, again, a couple of guests have mentioned it recently. It's less than a year old. I'm determined to read it, and there seems to be some good stuff in here. Even if not all of it's applicable to the industrial world terribly easily. Okay, so you said network visibility. That's where you start. I've heard other people say you start with network visibility as well. Are we talking about the kind of visibility that's looking at network traffic to see what the packets are, to see who's sending messages to whom, and are those messages benign or malicious, or does network visibility mean something else to you?
Looking at network traffic is extremely important, but it's half of the journey. There are really two sides to network visibility, and the NIST document does a great job to describe each of those approaches. The first one is called Analytic Monitoring, and it's to identify adverse action, as soon as possible with solutions such as intrusion detection systems, where you instrument networks with TAP or span or sensors, and there are great platforms available from different vendors specifically for OT. I'm thinking of Clarity, Dragos, Nozomi Networks. The other side of network visibility is called dynamic representation, and it's when we leverage modeling. It's how can we understand the network architecture and the dependencies that we have among our different assets. So, on one side you have monitoring, on the other side you have modeling, and together that's really how you can gain that comprehensive picture over your network and gain that full visibility over your environment. The way to summarize it is that traffic monitoring is to know which assets are connecting to which services right now, while network modeling is which assets can connect to which services. It's really understanding what can be done throughout your network and whether your segmentation is properly deployed and enforced. So you need both. They have different deployment and resources requirements. The network modeling is usually much faster because you don't need to instrument your network with sensors. You simply need the config files from your network devices, such as firewalls, routers, and switches.
Okay, but when you say faster, I'm a little confused. When the word modeling to me means sort of analysis. I imagine drawing diagrams, writing documents. Is this what modeling is? I mean, do you mentioned the config file. Are you staring at the config file and trying to figure out what it means, or is something else going on?
Well, that's the output that you'll get. But we have technology today to automatically extract and build a model from your network device configurations. You no longer need to stare at thousands of access rules and routes and interfaces. You can ingest that into an application that will build a visual topology of your environment, and then compute all the connectivity paths. That's really where the model is being leveraged, and that way you can check your segmentation. It's this process will depend on the size of your network, but when you start with a dozen or 20, 30 devices, firewalls, wireless switches, the parsing, so the extraction of information, from the configuration into a standard format, and then the modeling only takes a few minutes. So it's really a instant value type solution where you can have an accurate representation of your network extremely fast.
Andrew, is it really thousands of different routes, connections, rules when you're looking at a firewall, or is Robin exaggerating that number?
I don't think he's exaggerating at all. I mean, let me tell you a story, but then I'll drop into the sort of the general case. I was talking to a gentleman at a conference a few years ago. This is someone who managed the IT/OT interface at a small refinery. Now, refineries are not small. The small refinery was massive in my books, but still a small refinery. And I asked him about, so we're talking about the IT/OT interface. How many connections are there through that interface? And he looks me in the eye and he says, Andrew, if I had one of these, telephone wires, the old style, plain old telephone voice wires, for every connection that's allowed through the firewall, I'd have, if I bundle them all together, I'd have this many wires. And he holds his fingers like 14, 15 inches apart in a circle. And I'm going, whoa, that's a lot of connections. Subsequently, I've seen firewall configurations. I've seen this many connections. Why is all that? It's because firewalls are as secure as you make them. They're as secure as you invest effort in them. The more secure, the more effort you got to invest. I mean, the simplest firewall has got one rule: allow everything. No security value, but it's only got one rule, and you never have to change the rule. Okay, it's a maintenance-free firewall. The most secure firewall has a rule for every allowed connection. If I have 700 users on the IT network that are allowed to connect to the Pi server in the refinery's DMZ network, then, the most secure configuration says what's the IP address of every one of the laptops that's allowed to connect to the Pi server. Put a rule in for that. Not a rule saying allow anybody on the IT network to connect to the Pi server. A rule for every user. But now, of course, users come and go. They change responsibilities. They may not need access to the Pi server anymore. I'm constantly adjusting these rules. It's absolutely true that at the most secure sites, you see a lot of firewall rules. So that makes sense. I mean, if you've got, I've seen firewalls with as many as, 1,000 plus rules in them. And, there's lots of different firewalls in an industrial network. There's routers, there's who knows what. Having some automation on your side to analyze this and figure out what it means kind of makes sense. I mean, when you introduced yourself, you said network perception, works in the OT space. Do you have this kind of analysis tool that you're providing?
That's right. This is really what I've been involved in as part of the research that we were doing at the University of Illinois. And the goal was to, the initial research question was, if we have a network with a global access policy, that global access policy will be implemented by a distributed set of network equipment, firewalls, routers, switches. Now, how do you make sure that globally, at the level of your site or your network, that local implementation of your rule set is sound? Like, where do you have mismatch? Is your army of firewalls enforcing the right set of policies that together you have a good network segmentation? Or are there any misconfiguration or overly permissive rules or something that would allow lateral movement or helping on a breach or to expand an attack? So we first worked on a command line prototype that could extract that information from config files, build a model, and then give us a list of risk alerts or potential misconfigurations. And then we were fortunate to be able to work really closely with industry partners back at the university. So we worked with medium and large power utilities in the Midwest. And the feedback we got was really outstanding. So we decided to branch out of the lab, launch network perception, and put this initial prototype into a product called NPView. And it's a on-prem solution. It can be downloaded as a desktop application or a server-based application. And now it's visual. So you simply drag and drop your configuration files. You can start with a subset of your network with like your most critical firewalls. And then right away, you will see the model getting created with a visual representation of your network architecture and the path analysis in the background that will tell you if you have, overly permissive path or incorrect, remote access or, weak points in your network segmentation. Our initial use case has been to help, NERC auditors and utilities to prepare for NERC SIP audits, specifically around SIP5 and SIP3. And then on top of that initial use case, we've been, evolving the technology to support the needs of continuous, rule set review, ensuring that rules that are protecting critical assets are correctly defined and justified. And then, and now we're, adding more security use cases around that network segmentation verification as well as vulnerability assessment.
So, I mean, that makes sense in theory, but can you give me some examples? What kind of global policies are we talking about? What would a global policy look like? What would it sound like?
So a global policy would include rules such as, never allow any host from outside, and outside could be defined as the internet or the larger corporate network. So don't allow anything from outside to directly connect into your SCADA environment. And that's the type of rule that actually are being enforced by SIP5. You need to make sure that interactive remote access will stop at a jump host, or also called intermediate system. So that's the type of rule that could be enforced, locally by 5 or 10 different network devices, firewalls, routers. And you want to have that modeling capability to ensure that it's correctly implemented and there's no gap in your set of firewall rule sets. Another example would be, if you organize your network architecture according to the Berthier model, you have different layers. One rule that you want to enforce is that not one layer should be able to jump another layer and connect, 2 or more layers below. And so you want to ensure that you have DMZs and all connections are stopping through DMZs before continuing with, added authentication and multiple layers of defense. So that's another example of a global policy that you want to enforce across all your sites, and modeling can help you answer that question extremely fast.
Cyber attacks with physical consequences more than doubled in 2021. For industrial victims, the most common consequences were production outages at multiple sites. Most of the attacks were ransomware. And 2021 saw the first cloud-based ransomware attack. That attack compromised 1,500 businesses in the space of 45 minutes. These and other insights are included in a new threat report, co-authored by Waterfall Security Solutions and the new ICS Strive Industrial Incident Repository. For your copy of the report, please visit icsstrive.com. That's ICSSTRIVE.com.
Andrew, in the introduction to this episode, you mentioned that the kind of technology we were talking about here might be new to you. In what way, though, is this different than other solutions we've talked about on the show previously?
Well, previously we've talked about solutions that have different kinds of names, but these were solutions that would let you express policies for managing your automation systems, and would look at the configuration of the systems and tell you if the policies are still being complied with. But as I recall, those tools were looking primarily at hosts and files and file systems. So you could express a policy that says, I don't know, everyone has to change their password every 12 months. And the systems would tell you if everyone has changed their passwords every 12 months, or, who hasn't changed it, and you got to go tap them on the shoulder. Or, you might express a global policy that says only people in the network administration group are allowed to read any file that contains remote access passwords. And, there might be a dozen files like that on the system. And, over time, people change permissions, people modify stuff. But, these tools would tell you host-wise how much trouble you were in if a global policy had been violated. This is what Robin is describing is a technology, a product that can do that, but in the network space. So, for example, he mentioned jump host. Here's another example. He mentioned, the Purdue model. The Purdue model has layers of networks, layers of firewalls, and best practice in the Purdue model is that a host in one layer can only connect through one layer of firewall into the next layer, the next network, be it coming in or going out. It doesn't matter. You cannot punch a connection from your PLC straight out to the internet through 7 layers of firewall. So that's a global policy, says no connection may run through 2 layers of firewalls at the same time. And that's a policy that you would like to know if over time people have added rules to the firewalls that violate that policy, because that's a policy that sort of spans multiple firewalls. Another example of that is something called protocol breaks. Again, in the Purdue model, when you go from one layer to another, and then you go, from that layer to the next layer, it's not just that you're supposed to have different connections. They're supposed to be different protocols. And so you could express a rule that says when you're looking at, connections, between layers, no 2 firewalls in adjacent layers should be able to send the same service, the same, TCP port number through. So you always have to use different ports. And so presumably you're also always using different protocols. But again, this is a rule that sort of correlates the configurations of 2 different firewalls. It's not something you can see if you look at only one firewall. So this is what's new, is sort of the ability to express global rules about how you want access to be controlled, and analyze individual firewalls or routers or other devices and ask the question, are these global rules being followed? Okay, so can we get even more specific? When you go into a typical industrial site and you analyze their networks and their protocols, how much information is involved? How many firewalls, how many routers, how big do these systems get? How complicated are they?
Yeah, great question. And the good news is that we actually don't need to go inside the industrial site. Like that analysis, that modeling can be done offline without having to connect to the network that you're checking. Sites can vary greatly in size, from a substation with a single pair of firewalls to a large energy management system with 50 to 100 firewalls. The advantage of modeling is that you can start small and then grow from there, so you don't have to cover your entire network right away. The foundation to build the model will be the config files from firewalls, routers, and switches. This will generate that representation of your network architecture. Once you have that imported, then you can enrich your map with endpoint information. So if you have, for example, an asset inventory, or you can back up the ARP table from your network switches, or even if you have scan reports, like you may scan your environment or part of your environment with a OT friendly network scanner or endpoint scanner, you can add that additional data to your existing model to enrich it, and that will allow you to see more precise endpoints inside the network map, as well as being able to connect the dots between what are the host or endpoints with services open or even vulnerabilities, and how can I leverage the path analysis from the modeling with the vulnerability information to help me understand whether I have critical assets that are vulnerable being exposed, or whether I have the right set of mitigation layers in place with my access policy. But again, that can be done completely offline. Often when we work with our users, they have an existing backup system in which they store a daily copy of their configuration files. So we can piggyback on that backup system. We don't have to connect to any devices in the field, and that way they can generate that network representation and start their independent verification to make sure that the network is correctly segmented, and also to facilitate communication with different teams. Like often, we start working with an organization, and they will tell us, okay, this person in this office has the network map in their head, and pretty much no one else really understands how the network is configured. And so with the visual map, now we can have the common language to help everyone understand how things are connected and where we should invest in terms of cybersecurity.
And can you talk about your experience doing this? I mean, when you deploy the solution and you ingest all of these files and you, tell people, here's what you've got now, global policy wise, is that what you wanted? How do they react? Are they surprised sometimes? What do you find when you deploy this?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we've helped, hundreds of organizations to improve their network visibility and their verification capabilities. And what's striking is that there's always findings. I mean, I don't recall a single example in which we, launched the software and there was no risk alert. So over the years, we compiled a short list of the most frequent issues that we've encountered or that we're encountering in industrial control networks. And, the top three, and number one, a lack of egress access control. Like we see organizations, again, investing in firewalls, sometimes falling in the trap of this, set and forget. So that means that they put some rules to block traffic from outside to inside, but then the other direction isn't checked at all. That means there's open, all services, all ports allowed if you're starting from inside to go out. So really important to check that you have both ingress and egress directions, with traffic control there. The second most frequent issue we encounter would be, insecure remote access, organizations or environments where, requests from third-party vendors to to get a foothold inside the SCADA environment to be able to remotely configure or maintain some equipment. And often that remote access just doesn't respect, best practices around this principle of least privilege, right? So instead of blocking for a specific or allowing a specific range of IP or source IP addresses to a specific destination IP on specific ports, we see those remote access not being to the level of security they should be. And then the third one is overly permissive rules. Finding devices with any somewhere that no one paid attention to, that was added years ago that we haven't checked. And so these really impact the correctness of your network segmentation. Like those overly permissive rules are the weak points where that can be exploited in the case of lateral movement. Overall, we encounter a lot of organizations where they still need to strengthen their firewall change review workflow. Because they often lack a independent verification step. They go straight from a change request to a change design to then pushing that change of a configuration into production right away. So it's really important that they are setting up a workflow in which they include a step that allows an independent verification of the consequences of a change. And that's where the modeling is extremely useful, because you can compute what would be the impact of a config file or a rule set change on your overall security policy. So you include that step in your workflow. That way, a change cannot be pushed to production without this independent team that making sure that you're not putting your security or compliance posture in the worst situation, and then you vet that before allowing a change to go.
Andrew, the kind of thing that Robin's talking about, making changes before you actually test them and make sure that they're right, isn't this the kind of thing that you do in like an independent test bed scenario?
The short answer is yes, people do use testing and test beds. The longer answer is that it's harder than that. A lot of the rules in a firewall, most firewalls in the industrial space, most of the time have a rule that say allow nothing, which means that's kind of one rule or one rule per interface. Most of the hundreds or thousands of rules that we're talking about are rules that say allow something. If I create a new allow rule, it's easy enough to test, is that thing allowed now? It's much harder to test, is everything else that used to be disallowed still disallowed? What am I going to do? Test every possible connection from every possible TCP port on every possible IP address on the internet to see if they're all still disallowed? It's just not practical. So, you have to study the configuration. You have to see if the changes you made, and often it's more than just a single rule. What you think of as a single rule might actually touch 3 or 4 or 5 different parts of the configuration in these sort of complicated professional grade firewalls. So yeah, there's testing. Yeah, there's analysis. It's just hard when you have, to manage these sort of aggressive firewall configurations with hundreds or thousands of rules. There's a lot of labor involved. This has certainly been educational for me. Thank you for joining us. Before we let you go, can you say a few words? What are the most important points that our listeners should take away from this episode?
Thanks, Andrew, for the question. And as takeaways, number one, it's important that we all understand that networks are growing in complexity every day. Your network was simpler 5 years ago and will be more complex 5 years from now. So we need to, leverage technology and visualization to make sure that we understand the environment we have to defend. Second, we really need to shift our mindset from a set and forget to a set and verify. You deploy security solutions, but it's just the first step in your journey towards becoming cyber resilient. You need to continuously check and verify that the solutions in place are still, enforcing the right set of protection in order to be cyber resilient, to keep operating despite being under threat. And then third, it's a great community. Like, working in the OT environment is all about partnerships. I really feel fortunate that the NPView or technology came out of academia with strong support from DOE, from DHS, and then really feedback from industry partners. And that's really what we need. Like, we need those types of dialogues in order to build solutions that are respectful of the specific requirements of an OT and ICS environment, but also extremely intuitive, extremely easy to use for those professionals. And then in terms of call to action, I'd like to invite your listeners to do two things. Number one, there's a great cyber resiliency review questionnaire available on the CISA website. So if you search for CISA CRR Cyber Resiliency Review, you'll find the webpage. I invite everyone to go through that questionnaire to understand where they are on this cyber resiliency journey and where they have to invest. And then second call to action is, 75% of firewalls have some type of misconfigurations. So go check your rule sets today. Like, don't delay. Don't rely on a set and forget. Make sure that you have this independent verification practice in place to stop any of those misconfigurations from becoming a severe breach later.
Andrew, to close us out here, what are the consequences to an industrial facility if you do the kinds of mistakes that Robin has outlined here, if you set and forget, if you fail to update your firewall policies, procedures, and don't have a kind of tool like this?
There's two sets of consequences. Let's talk about sort of the consequences to your firewalls. It's a truism that over time, if you've got sort of poorly managed, poorly inspected firewalls, over time, those firewalls generally become more and more like routers. I mean, think about it, the path of least resistance. Once you make a mistake, once you've added, however temporarily, an any-to-any rule in your firewall and then forgotten about it, what happens? All of your trouble calls stop. Nobody complains about the firewall anymore. All your change requests stop. You can just forget the firewall. Look at that. We must have finally got it right. Nobody's complaining about it anymore because it's not doing anything. It's not blocking anything anymore. It's basically useless. And in terms of consequences for the industrial facility, now you've got all sorts of crap that can leak into the industrial process, everything from ransomware to, truly nasty targeted attacks that are determined to do, physical damage to your process. What a technology like this gives us is the ability to express, high-level policies. The simplest of which, we're not just talking NERC-CIP, we're talking about, our own internal policies. Policies like, don't be stupid, never allow any-to-any in any firewall, anywhere in the industrial network. And, give me an alarm if anybody ever configures such a thing. Basic stuff like this, so that you don't lose an any-to-any in your thousands of rules and scratch your head why no one's complaining about the firewall anymore.
All right, then with that, thanks to Robin Berthier for speaking with you, Andrew. And as always, Andrew, thank you for speaking with me.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thank you to everybody out there listening.